Bergen-Belsen was a concentration camp where violence did not only stem from superior orders, but also from those who guarded the prisoners on a daily basis. Among them, the female guards contributed to the daily suffering in a place marked by hunger, disease, and neglect. After the liberation, the horrors that were exposed highlighted the urgent need for justice. Through military trials, abuses, punishments, and systematic cruelty against the prisoners were revealed. Not all the female guards managed to evade the consequences. Several were arrested, tried, and sentenced in proceedings aimed at ending impunity. The severity of what was experienced in the camp left a wound that is hard to heal. The testimonies, documents, and images collected after the liberation left no doubt about what had occurred. But what happened to those women who took part in the camp's terror? Did they truly pay for what they did? The liberation, discovery of horror. In April of 1945, British and Canadian forces arrived at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Lower Saxony, Germany. Although reports claimed it held only prisoners of war, what they found was far worse. Tens of thousands of unburied corpses and about 60,000 people alive, but gravely ill. Most of them were Jews. On April 15th, soldiers from the 63rd British Anti-Tank Regiment were the first to enter the camp. Nothing they had seen during the war had prepared them for something so terrible. Piles of bodies, barely conscious survivors, and diseases out of control. From that day forward, about 500 people died each day due to the typhus epidemic and malnutrition. Although Bergen-Belsen was not created as an extermination camp, the extreme conditions turned it into one of the deadliest camps. In just the final months before its liberation, nearly 35,000 prisoners died. The first contact occurred when a German emissary with a white flag requested a truce, alerting the British to the spread of typhus. At first, the officers hesitated, but they decided to move toward the camp. Upon arrival, they immediately saw that the situation was far worse than expected. After the liberation, new problems arose. Many survivors died during the first week because their bodies could not handle the rich foods they were given. The lack of experience in this type of emergency made managing the crisis very difficult. The British organized the burial of the thousands of dead. They forced the captured SS guards to collect and bury the bodies, working without gloves or protection. This task exposed many to typhus and other diseases. In the following weeks, 17 members of the SS personnel died of typhus. In addition, 3 were shot after attempting to escape. In the early days, there was confusion in the camp. Since there was not enough British personnel to control the situation, they allowed Hungarian troops to continue guarding it. This led to incidents where some prisoners, desperately searching for food, were killed. The typhus epidemic continued to spread. There were not enough medications or even the minimum conditions for hygiene. Many prisoners were transferred to a former nearby military camp, where they began to receive better care, although it was already too late for thousands of them. The scene inside the camp was desolate. Children alone, adults unable to walk, lifeless bodies mixed with mud, and an unbearable stench that permeated the entire environment. The few improvised hospitals filled up immediately. Over time, the British managed to bring some order. They set up field hospitals, distributed appropriate food for the survivors' severe malnutrition, and began to clean up the place. They forced the former SS guards to bury the dead in the same humiliating way they had treated their victims. They were not given enough food or protection, and worked under constant threats. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen brought freedom, but it also showed that the suffering of many was far from over. The physical and emotional aftermath would last a long time. This event became one of the most important moments to show the world the horrors of the concentration camps. The images captured by British soldiers circulated widely and served as crucial evidence in war crimes trials. Belsen trials, the beginning of justice. 5 months after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, the trials to hold those responsible began. This process, known as the Belsen trial, was one of the first major efforts to bring to justice those who had taken part in the crimes of the Nazi regime. The British military court was set up in a former gymnasium in the city of Lüneburg, Germany. The trial drew significant international attention as it publicly exposed the scale of the abuses committed in the concentration camps. 45 women and 480 men who had worked as guards or staff members were charged. Among them were figures such as Irma Grese, Johanna Borman and Elisabeth Volkenrath. All faced serious charges, including torture, murder and inhumane treatment of prisoners. One of the most striking aspects of the trial was the presentation of films as evidence. It was the first time in history that video recordings were used to prove war crimes. The footage showed the horror discovered at Bergen-Belsen and left an indelible impression on judges, lawyers and spectators. The judicial process revealed many details about daily life in the camp: brutal punishments, forced marches, the use of dogs to attack prisoners, and conditions of extreme hunger. Stories from survivors also emerged, those who, despite their weakness, testified courageously against their former tormentors. The trial lasted 2 months. In the end, 677 people were convicted in various proceedings held in the British zone of Germany between 1945 and 1949. Of those, 230 were sentenced to death. The executions were carried out mainly in the prison of Hamelin. Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most experienced executioner, was responsible for carrying out the sentences. In total, 191 men and 10 women were hanged under his supervision. Among the women executed were Irma Grese, Johanna Borman and Elisabeth Volkenrath. They were hanged on December 13, 1945, after their crimes were proven with direct evidence and testimonies. During the trials, some tried to defend themselves by claiming they were only following orders. However, the victims' testimonies and the evidence showed that many acted with cruelty on their own initiative. In several cases, witnesses described how the female guards beat prisoners, sent them to their deaths, or humiliated them without any necessity. Others testified about the use of trained dogs to attack those who did not obey quickly. The trial also highlighted the role hunger played as a tool of control. Many prisoners died not only from disease, but from severe malnutrition deliberately inflicted. The court applied British military law to judge these crimes. Although some of the accused received lighter sentences, the most serious cases ended in death penalties. The organization of the trial allowed for the collection of testimonies and documentation that would be essential for later processes, such as the Nuremberg trials. Despite the seriousness of the proceedings, not all criminals were brought to justice. Some managed to escape or received lesser penalties. However, the Belsen trial marked a first concrete effort to hold accountable those who took part in the atrocities. The impact of this trial was immediate. Public opinion in Britain and other Allied countries was shocked upon learning the details of what had occurred. Images of the corpses, the stories of survivors, and the confessions of the accused served to show irrefutably the extent of the horror. The Belsen trial not only judged the guilty, but also became a reminder to the world. It showed that mass crimes would not go unpunished and set a precedent for international justice in the years to come. Although the survivors could not recover everything they had lost, at least they saw their tormentors face the consequences of their actions. Albert Pierrepoint, the executioner of the sentences. When the Belsen trials came to an end, the phase of executing the condemned began. The task fell to Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most experienced executioner. Pierrepoint came from a family dedicated to this profession. His father and uncle had also been official executioners. From a young age, Albert knew he wanted to follow the same path. In 1932, at the age of 27, he carried out his first execution as an assistant, and by 1941 he was already acting as the principal executioner. He was known for his professionalism and precision. He always carefully calculated the length of the rope according to the person's weight and height to ensure a swift death. Throughout his career, Pierrepoint executed more than 600 people, including common criminals, spies, and after the war, Nazi war criminals. For the executions in Germany, he was transferred to Hamelin prison in Lower Saxony. There, a special gallows was installed in a separate wing of the main building. The structure allowed for double hangings, although in some cases executions were carried out one at a time. December 13, 1945, was one of the most intense days. That morning, Pierrepoint hanged 3 women and 10 men, all condemned for crimes at Bergen-Belsen. Among them were Irma Grese, Johanna Borman, and Elisabeth Volkenrath. Female executions had to be overseen by a female prison officer. Nonetheless, Pierrepoint insisted on personally directing all procedures. According to reports, Irma Grese, barely 22 years old, walked to the gallows without losing her composure. She attempted to resist the placement of the hood, but the guards restrained her. It is said that she shouted "quick" in German just before Pierrepoint pulled the lever. Grese's execution was not as quick as usual. The adjustment of the rope was not correct, and the young woman died by strangulation instead of an immediate neck break. Some witnesses interpreted this as a deliberate act by Pierrepoint, although official reports do not confirm it. Johanna Borman was next. Short in stature and utterly defeated, she offered no resistance. Her death was swift and uncomplicated. Elisabeth Volkenrath, who had also faced serious charges, stepped onto the scaffold shortly after. She had been responsible for supervising female prisoners at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Her execution was carried out quickly. After the women, Pierrepoint proceeded to hang the 10 men. On the double gallows, they dropped 2 at a time, reducing the time needed to carry out the sentences. Pierrepoint worked with a small team that included assistants to manage the process and prepare the condemned. Every movement was swift and calculated. During his stay in Germany, Pierrepoint executed 226 people between 1945 and 1949. On some days, he carried out more than 10 executions. Despite his efficiency, Pierrepoint viewed his work as a duty, not as a source of personal satisfaction. He strove to make each execution as swift and humane as possible within the bounds of the procedure. In 1956, after a disagreement with the government over payment issues, Pierrepoint decided to retire. He submitted his resignation immediately and never practiced again. He spent his final years running a pub with his wife in Southport, near Liverpool. He died in 1992 at the age of 87. Irma Grese, the Beast of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Irma Grese is one of the most remembered names among the female guards of the Nazi concentration camps. Her story began in 1923 in Rechen, Germany. She grew up in a humble family and faced a childhood marked by family tragedies, such as the suicide of her mother when she was only 13 years old. After leaving school at the age of 14, she worked on farms and in local shops. In 1939, she joined a sanatorium run by Nazi doctors as an assistant. There, she was exposed to medical experiments on prisoners, an experience that would influence her future behavior. At the age of 18, Grese entered the Ravensbrück concentration camp to train as a guard. In 1943, she was assigned to Auschwitz, where she quickly gained notoriety for her cruelty. She supervised more than 18,000 female prisoners, many of them Hungarian Jews. Her presence was marked by her immaculate uniform, her cellophane-lined leather whip, and her pistol. She was known for brutally beating the prisoners, especially during roll calls, where any error or delay was punished with lashes or blows. Grese also used 2 large dogs as part of her dominance in the camp. She often released them against prisoners who could not keep up during forced marches or who committed minor infractions. Among the worst accusations against her is her participation in the selections for the gas chambers. Alongside figures like Josef Mengele, she was responsible for deciding who would live and who would die. Many witnesses stated that she selected the youngest and most beautiful prisoners to be sent to their deaths. At Auschwitz, Grese was feared not only for her physical brutality, but also for her personal behavior. She was attributed with intimate relationships with both SS officers and some prisoners, who were later cruelly punished. In early 1945, as the Soviet army advanced, Grese was transferred to Bergen-Belsen along with other Auschwitz staff members. There, she continued her sadistic behavior despite the increasingly desperate conditions in the camp. In Bergen-Belsen, sanitary conditions were disastrous. Hunger, typhus, and lack of water caused hundreds of deaths each day. Even so, Grese continued to impose brutal punishments. She beat starving prisoners who tried to obtain food and forced them to perform physical exercises until they collapsed. On April 15, 1945, when British forces liberated the camp, Grese was captured along with other guards. During her interrogation, she admitted to certain abuses, although she tried to minimize her responsibility by claiming she was only following orders. At the Belsen trial, witnesses described her crimes in detail. Several survivors recounted how Grese beat, whipped, and sent hundreds of prisoners to their deaths. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Grese was found guilty and sentenced to death. She was only 22 years old at the time of her execution, becoming the youngest woman executed under British law in the 20th century. On December 13, 1945, at Hamelin Prison, Albert Pierrepoint carried out her execution. It is said that she walked to the gallows with coldness and even tried to resist having the hood placed on her. The story of Irma Grese is one of the clearest examples of how a young person could become one of the most cruel instruments of a regime based on hatred and violence. Elisabeth Volkenrath, rise and fall of a supervisor. Elisabeth Volkenrath was one of the most feared female guards of the Nazi concentration camps. She was born in Germany in 1919 and began her career as a guard at the Ravensbrück camp in 1941. From her earliest days, she demonstrated efficiency in her work, which soon led her to occupy positions of greater responsibility. In early 1942, she was transferred to Auschwitz, where she first served as a guard and later as a supervisor of the female sections. Although she was not characterized by extreme sadism like some other guards, her firmness and involvement in the selections for the gas chambers made her a feared figure. During her time at Auschwitz, Volkenrath married an SS officer named Heinz Volkenrath, a block leader who also actively participated in the selections and punishments of the prisoners. Together, they formed a couple that, according to survivors' testimonies, showed very little compassion towards the victims. When the Soviet army approached Auschwitz, Elisabeth was sent to Bergen-Belsen. There, she continued her work as a supervisor of the prisoners, although the conditions in the camp were much worse. At Bergen-Belsen, the overcrowding, the lack of food, and the spread of diseases such as typhus caused hundreds of deaths each day. In that atmosphere of despair, Volkenrath maintained discipline in a brutal manner. According to witnesses, she took part in physical punishments, beatings, and the denial of medical assistance to sick prisoners. Although some tried to describe her as an official who was merely following orders, the testimony of the survivors indicated that she made her own decisions, which increased the suffering of the inmates. Volkenrath was captured by British forces when they liberated Bergen-Belsen in April of 1945. During her trial, she attempted to justify her actions by saying she was only performing her duty. However, the evidence against her was overwhelming. Proof was presented of her involvement in the selections for the gas chambers at Auschwitz, as well as her cruel behavior at Bergen-Belsen. Testimonies spoke of beatings of sick prisoners, constant humiliations, and a ruthless treatment of the most vulnerable. The military tribunal declared her guilty, and she was sentenced to death. Elisabeth Volkenrath was hanged on December 13, 1945, at the Hamelin prison, along with 2 other female guards from Bergen-Belsen. She walked to the scaffold without showing any resistance. Her death was swift, unlike that of other condemned individuals. It was one of the cases where justice caught up with those who had abused their power ruthlessly. The name of Elisabeth Volkenrath became associated with the worst abuses of the Nazi concentration camp system. Johanna Borman, the guard, and her dog. Johanna Borman was one of the concentration camp guards who went down in history for her brutality. She was born in Germany in 1893, and before the war worked as a domestic servant and animal caretaker. In 1938, she joined the staff of the Lichtenberg camp, where she began her career as a guard. She was later transferred to Ravensbrück, a women's camp, and then to Auschwitz, where her reputation for harshness grew rapidly. At Auschwitz, Borman became known for her cruel treatment of female prisoners. She was recognized for patrolling with a German shepherd dog she had trained to attack those who disobeyed her orders. According to multiple testimonies, she ordered the animal to bite prisoners as punishment. In late 1944, as the Soviets advanced from the east, Borman was transferred to Bergen-Belsen. There, she continued to exert her authority mercilessly amid the chaos and misery that prevailed in the camp. Borman routinely imposed physical punishments. She beat sick and weakened prisoners and often participated in selections that decided which inmates would be transferred or eliminated. After the camp was liberated by British forces in April of 1945, Borman was arrested along with other Bergen-Belsen staff members. During her interrogation, she admitted to using her dog to maintain order, though she downplayed the abuse. At the Belsen trial, several witnesses testified against her. They recounted how she mistreated prisoners and used the dog as a tool of terror. Her participation in beatings and her indifference to suffering were described in strong detail. Borman was found guilty of war crimes. The court determined that her conduct demonstrated a complete lack of humanity and respect for human life. She was sentenced to death. On December 13, 1945, Johanna Borman was executed at Hamelin prison, along with other female guards from Bergen-Belsen. She was 52 years old at the time of her death. She walked to the scaffold without resistance. Her execution was swift and marked the closing of one of the darkest chapters of crimes committed in the camps. The story of Johanna Borman serves as a reminder of how ordinary people became enforcers of violence and terror under the Nazi system. Herta Ehlert, the guard who admitted her guilt. Herta Ehlert was one of the few female guards in the Nazi concentration camps who openly acknowledged her involvement in the abuses. She was born in Germany in 1905 and began her career as a supervisor at the Ravensbrück camp. Before joining the camp system, she worked as a kitchen assistant in civilian establishments. She had no military training or background in security. However, the Nazi regime's need for female personnel led her to join the SS in administrative roles. Her first major assignment was Ravensbrück, where she received basic training in discipline and prisoner control. She was taught to enforce order through force and to follow instructions without question. From there, she was transferred to Majdanek, where she continued her surveillance duties. At Majdanek and later in Auschwitz, Ehlert was responsible for supervising women's barracks. Although her reputation for cruelty did not reach that of figures like Irma Grese, several testimonies indicated that she imposed severe physical punishments and participated in selections for forced labor. It was mentioned that she beat prisoners who failed to follow rules or collapsed from exhaustion during their tasks. In early 1945, as the Third Reich's situation deteriorated and battlefronts receded, Ehlert was transferred to Bergen-Belsen. There, she served as an assistant in organizing the camp during its final and worst months. In Bergen-Belsen, life was nearly unlivable. Diseases spread uncontrollably, there was not enough food and bodies piled up unburied. Amid this chaos, Ehlert tried to maintain a semblance of order, albeit through harsh methods. Despite the extreme conditions, she continued enforcing discipline among the prisoners. After the camp was liberated by British forces, Ehlert was arrested. During her interrogation, she admitted to beating prisoners and using force to impose discipline. She acknowledged that the camp's conditions were horrific, but claimed she had tried to maintain control in a desperate situation. At the Belsen trial, her attitude differed from that of other defendants. She did not deny the abuses, although she attempted to justify them by saying she was following superior orders and acting within the extreme conditions of the camp. She also stated that she sometimes tried to help certain prisoners when possible. Her testimony drew attention for the frankness with which she described the internal workings of the camps and the role female guards played. She explained how selections, punishments, and daily tasks were organized. Her confessions helped provide a clearer understanding of the power dynamics operating within the concentration camps. Although she accepted responsibility, the severity of her actions led to her conviction. However, she did not receive the death penalty. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Ehlert served only part of her sentence. She was released in 1953 after serving less than half of the imposed sentence due to a general amnesty. She then lived a quiet life in Germany until her death. Her case stands out among the post-World War II proceedings because, unlike many other defendants, she did not deny her participation or attempt to downplay the facts. However, her acceptance of guilt did not change the pain caused to the victims. Herta Ehlert represents a less visible face of the camp system, individuals who, without being in the highest levels of power, carried out policies of violence and repression in a direct and routine manner. Herta Bothe, strength and repression. Herta Bothe was one of the guards who went down in history for her participation in the abuses committed in the Nazi concentration camps. She was born in 1921 in Tetterow, Germany. Before the war, she worked as an assistant nurse. In 1942, she was recruited to serve as a guard in the camps. Her height, close to 1.80 meters, and her imposing build led some to nickname her the Giantess of Belsen. She began her training at Ravensbrück, the main training camp for female SS members. After her training, Bothe was sent to several camps, including Auschwitz and later Bergen-Belsen. During her time in these places, numerous witnesses reported her violent behavior toward prisoners. At Auschwitz, she worked supervising groups of female prisoners assigned to forced labor. She was known for brutally beating inmates with a wooden stick she always carried with her. The force of her attacks left many victims seriously injured. When she was transferred to Bergen-Belsen in March of 1945, the camp was already in a state of extreme neglect. Hunger, disease, and filth dominated the place. Despite this, Bothe maintained an attitude of relentless harshness. Several witnesses claim to have seen Bothe beating prisoners without apparent reason. She especially punished with violence those who collapsed from weakness or failed to follow orders quickly. During the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, Bothe was captured along with other SS personnel. At the Belsen trial, her presence did not go unnoticed due to her height and bearing. During her defense, Herta Bothe admitted to beating prisoners but claimed she acted to maintain order and prevent total chaos. However, the testimonies against her revealed a pattern of systematic abuse. In court, several survivors identified her as one of the most violent guards. They recounted how she used her strength to mercilessly punish those who could barely remain standing. Unlike other female guards who were tried, Bothe was not sentenced to death. She received a sentence of 10 years in prison. Her sentence sparked debate, as many believed her actions deserved harsher punishment. Bothe was released in 1951 after serving only part of her sentence. After leaving prison, she lived a reserved life in Germany. She stayed out of the public eye and lived under another surname to avoid recognition. She worked modest jobs and avoided speaking about her past. In 1999, in a rare television interview, Bothe spoke about her participation in the camps. During the interview, she claimed she had been forced to accept her post and denied having killed anyone. These statements generated negative reactions, especially among Holocaust survivor groups. Many considered her stance a lack of accountability for the actions committed. The program in which she appeared was broadcast in Germany and sparked public debate about the role of individuals within the Nazi system. Although Bothe claimed she was just doing her job, for many she was an example of how denial and minimization of the facts remained present even decades later. Herta Bothe died in 2000. Her figure remains forever associated with the brutality suffered by thousands of prisoners in the concentration camps. Irene Haske, Abuses from the Kitchen. Irene Haske is one of the lesser-known names among the female staff who served at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. However, her role within the abuse system reflects how violence was sustained not only by high-profile figures, but also by those in secondary positions. Haske primarily worked in the camp's kitchen, a position that, far from being insignificant, gave her important control over food distribution, a vital resource for the prisoners' survival. At Bergen-Belsen, extreme hunger was part of the daily punishment. Those who worked in the kitchen could directly or indirectly decide the life or death of the inmates. Access to food became an instrument of power. Various testimonies collected after the camp's liberation indicated that Haske did not only carry out administrative duties, but she also actively participated in the mistreatment of prisoners. She beat those who approached the kitchen looking for scraps or tried to obtain extra food. Her work in the kitchen did not distance her from the acts of brutality that characterized the camp. On the contrary, several survivors pointed her out as a feared figure due to her aggressive behavior and lack of compassion. When the British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen in April of 1945, Haske was arrested along with other staff members. During her capture, she offered no resistance. She was quickly identified by some prisoners who recognized her as one of those responsible for the mistreatment. During the preliminary interrogations, she tried to minimize her role, claiming that she was just a minor worker with no authority over the prisoners. She insisted that she was merely following orders and did not participate in important decisions. However, the evidence presented, along with testimonies from survivors, proved that her responsibility went beyond kitchen duties. Her active participation in acts of violence placed her among the accused at the Belsen trial. During the judicial process, Haske faced charges of war crimes. Her defense attempted to present her as an irrelevant figure within the camp system, trying to distance her from the worst abuses. The survivors, however, offered a different account. They testified that Haske beat weakened prisoners, denied food to those about to collapse, and occasionally insulted those who asked for help. These acts, though individual, were part of a structure of cruelty that permeated every corner of Bergen-Belsen. Ultimately, the court concluded that although her role was not one of leadership, she had significantly contributed to the suffering of the inmates. She was found guilty and sentenced to prison. Her sentence was shorter compared to the main perpetrators. This difference reflected the hierarchy of responsibilities within the camp, but did not exempt her personal involvement. After serving her sentence, Irene Haske's public trace was lost. There are no clear records of her life after prison. It is assumed that, like many other former staff members of concentration camps, she led a discreet life, avoiding public scrutiny. Her story is an example of how the oppression system in the concentration camps did not solely depend on prominent figures, but also on numerous collaborators who, from more discreet positions, actively contributed to the suffering. Irene Haske, although less known than other female guards, was part of a machinery of violence where every participant, regardless of their position, held responsibility. Haske's case demonstrates that brutality in the camps was not limited to large-scale acts. Small daily actions, such as denying food or beating a vulnerable prisoner, reinforced a system that relied on constant dehumanization. Revenge in the final days. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, by British forces not only ended Nazi control over the camp, but also unleashed episodes of violence among the very prisoners who had been freed. After years of abuse, hunger and death, the pent-up rage of many inmates exploded against the SS personnel and the so-called kapos, privileged prisoners who collaborated with the guards in exchange for better conditions. The kapos were, for the most part, prisoners who had taken on control roles within the camp. They organized work, maintained order, and often participated in punishments. For the other prisoners, they represented an extension of the daily oppression. With the fall of the Nazi system in Bergen-Belsen, the British were overwhelmed by the magnitude of the humanitarian crisis and could not immediately control all sectors of the camp. In that power vacuum, spontaneous acts of revenge erupted. Several witnesses recounted that in the days following liberation, some kapos were beaten to death by angry groups of prisoners. Others were dragged out of the barracks and summarily executed. Violence was also directed at captured SS personnel within the camp. Although the British tried to protect the prisoners from uncontrolled reprisals, in several cases they could not prevent lynchings. The chaotic conditions, hunger, disease, and lack of structure made it almost impossible to maintain order during the first days. British officers focused their efforts on trying to save lives, controlling the spread of typhus, and burying the dead, leaving other matters on the back burner. The resentment against the kapos was not limited to their role as collaborators. In many cases, they were accused of benefiting while the rest suffered. Some had abused their position, mistreating other prisoners or stealing the scarce food rations. The lack of immediate justice pushed many survivors to take action into their own hands. For them, seeing their former oppressors suffer represented a form of direct justice after so much accumulated pain. There are no exact figures on how many kapos and guards died in these revenge episodes. British official reports mention isolated incidents, but the priority of documenting each event was low due to the public health emergency they faced. As order was restored in the camp, the British took measures to protect all survivors, including the former kapos and captured SS personnel. Many were later transferred to prisons to face legal proceedings. These acts of revenge, though understandable from a human perspective, showed the level of desperation and trauma the prisoners had endured. The violence of those days was a direct response to the system of brutality that had characterized life in Bergen-Belsen. The killings for revenge were neither organized nor formally directed. They were a spontaneous reaction in an environment where law and order had collapsed, and where the pain and accumulated injustice of years found an immediate outlet. Errors after the camp's fall. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen by British forces on April 15, 1945, was a pivotal moment, but it also led to a series of errors that cost many lives that could have been saved. Upon arrival, the British found a scene of complete devastation, thousands of unburied bodies, diseases out of control, and tens of thousands of survivors in critical condition. The magnitude of the tragedy overwhelmed any pre-existing plans of action. One of the main mistakes was underestimating the severity of the sanitary situation. Although typhus had already spread massively, quarantine measures were slow to be applied effectively. In the early days, many liberated prisoners wandered freely throughout the camp and its surroundings. This lack of control contributed to the spread of deadly diseases among both the survivors and the British soldiers themselves. Another serious issue was food distribution. In an attempt to help, the British handed out standard military rations such as canned meat and hard biscuits. For prisoners who had been in a state of extreme malnutrition for months or years, these foods were impossible to digest. Many survivors died due to gastrointestinal complications caused by consuming such heavy food. The lack of knowledge about how to properly feed people suffering from severe starvation had fatal consequences. Additionally, there was an initial shortage of specialized medical personnel. While the British mobilized healthcare teams, these were insufficient to care for the tens of thousands of severely ill people. The field hospitals set up could not keep up with the demand. Many prisoners died waiting for medical attention or without receiving any effective help. Another mistake was entrusting surveillance tasks to foreign troops, such as the Hungarian soldiers who were present at the camp. There were reports of abuses and killings committed by these guards against liberated prisoners in the first few days. There were also issues with administering immediate justice. Some SS personnel were held in the same camp alongside the liberated prisoners, which created tensions and acts of violence. Over time, the British began to correct some of these errors. They brought in nutrition experts to develop special diets, set up larger hospitals, and separated the prisoners from the former guards. However, for many, these improvements came too late. It is estimated that between 13,000 and 14,000 prisoners died in the weeks following liberation due to diseases, severe malnutrition, and mistakes in the initial treatments. The British commanders themselves later acknowledged that, although they acted in good faith, their lack of preparation to face a humanitarian disaster of such magnitude contributed to the high number of deaths. The experience of Bergen-Belsen served as a painful lesson. In future camp liberations, such as those in other parts of Germany, the Allied forces acted with greater caution, learning from the mistakes made at Belsen. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen was an act of humanity, but it also revealed the difficulties of managing massive suffering and the consequences of being unprepared to face a disaster of such scale. Josef Kramer, the man in front of the justice. Josef Kramer was one of the most prominent figures within the Nazi concentration camp system. He was born in 1906 in Munich, Germany, and joined the Nazi Party and the SS in 1932. His career within the concentration camps began at Dachau, where he served as a guard. He later worked at Sachsenhausen and Mauthausen, gaining experience in the administration of prisoners. In 1940, he was transferred to Auschwitz, where he held administrative and supervisory roles. During his time at Auschwitz III, he was involved in the internal organization of the camp and in overseeing forced labor. In 1944, Kramer was appointed commander of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the primary extermination center of the Auschwitz complex. He supervised the arrival of prisoner transports and the selections that decided who would be sent to the gas chambers. His time at Birkenau was marked by his efficiency in carrying out the orders of the Nazi regime. He was described as a cold, methodical man who was completely loyal to his superiors. When Soviet troops advanced toward Auschwitz in late 1944, Kramer was transferred to Bergen-Belsen to assume command of the camp during its final phase. Unlike Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen did not have extermination facilities like gas chambers. However, under his leadership, the conditions at the camp deteriorated rapidly. Overcrowding, a lack of food, and the collapse of sanitation led to a humanitarian catastrophe. Thousands of prisoners died each week from hunger, disease, and neglect. During his administration, Kramer showed little initiative to improve the living conditions of the prisoners. Despite being aware of the situation, he did not implement effective measures to stop the massive deaths. When the British forces arrived at Bergen-Belsen, they found Kramer at the camp. He was immediately arrested and photographed while walking around the site with British soldiers, showing the inhumane conditions he had allowed. During interrogations, Kramer claimed that he had requested help to improve the camp's situation, but that his requests had been ignored by his superiors. However, testimonies from survivors and other officials showed that he did not take concrete actions to protect the prisoners. At the Belsen trial, Kramer faced charges of war crimes. He was one of the main defendants due to his role as commander. The testimonies presented against him detailed the lack of medical care, the absence of adequate food, and the inhumane treatment of the prisoners under his command. Kramer was found guilty and sentenced to death. On December 13, 1945, he was hanged at Hamelin prison along with other members of the Bergen-Belsen staff. His figure remains etched in history as that of a bureaucrat of horror, someone who, without issuing direct orders of physical violence, allowed and facilitated the conditions that led to the deaths of tens of thousands of people. Josef Kramer's case demonstrates that responsibility for war crimes does not only lie with those who carry out acts of violence, but also with those in command positions who allow suffering to continue without intervening. In April of 1945, British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen and discovered a place of death and extreme suffering. Tens of thousands of prisoners, mostly Jews, lay dead or were dying slowly from hunger and disease. What they found surpassed any horror they had witnessed before. Despite efforts to save lives, the lack of preparation and mistakes in treating the survivors led to further losses. Many died from infections, severe malnutrition, and complications after receiving inappropriate food. With the Belsen trials, those directly responsible for these crimes were brought to justice. Figures such as Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Josef Kramer were tried, convicted, and executed. It was demonstrated that the cruelty of both those who gave orders and those who carried them out would not be ignored. The executions, carried out by Albert Pierrepoint, closed one of the darkest chapters of the camp. Stories like those of Herta Ehlert, Herta Bothe, and Irene Haske made it clear that even those with minor roles were part of the oppressive system. In the days following the liberation, some prisoners took justice into their own hands, attacking former capos and collaborators. These spontaneous acts showed the depth of the suffering accumulated after years of violence. The story of Bergen-Belsen teaches that horror can grow not only from direct acts of violence but also from neglect and indifference, and it serves as a reminder that even amidst chaos, the need for justice is a necessary step in facing open wounds. Bergen-Belsen stands as a permanent warning about the risks of dehumanization and the importance of never forgetting the horrors that were once possible.